All right, for announcements, let's just say for attendance, things are going to be like they usually are for you guys in person. Send me an email just to remind me that you were here. You guys will get extra credit, not only for being in person, but also for being early. For those of you online, we'll just do it like we usually do. Send an email with the keywords. Make sure you do it before 9 a.m. Anything after that, and you'll need to do the questions. So that's it for attendance. And Flores, please send me an email to remind me that you were here on time. Please. All right. The other announcement will be for lab. And I know I put it out there, but it's really simple. You just need to go for this week. You're not even getting a new lab because, we're towards the end here. So I want you to be able to work on fixing your grade and also, get ready for finals. So for lab this week, just pick your worst lab and tell me which one it is and redo it. Now, obviously, you don't have to completely redo it unless it's your worst lab is a lab you didn't do. And just fix your mistakes. Or like I said, if you just completely didn't do one, do it. Obviously, I know this is going to be harder for you guys, especially if you just never did the lab, because it's been a while since you've done that lab. So you might need somebody to jog your memory. In which case, come to me, right? Meet me during office hours, or I can meet you during the lab time. Monday and or Wednesday during lab. Let me help you. Like we can just sit down together and we can talk about the lab, and I can tell you the way it went when we did it, and I can tell you what should have happened, and then I can help you come along with those answers. The point is, you don't have to do it alone. So yeah, that's how lab's going to work. So you'll pick your worst lab, fix it. So not only will that partially fix that original grade, because it's past the due date, so it won't be a full fix, but whatever your new grade would have been for fixing it will be your grade for this week, if that makes sense. So if you had one that you just didn't do, for example, and then you go and you do it and you get a 100%, well, your grade for that original grade will now be half, right? Because 0 plus 15 or full credit, half of that, half credit. But your grade for this week would be the full 20 points. So anyway, that's what you have to do this week. Let's do Friday as usual. That's it. Any questions? Of course, if it's online, I can't hear you, but just in case, anybody have any questions about lab? All right. I'm going to jump quickly back into chapter 20. Hopefully we can finish it. Let's see. Where are you at here? Chapter 20. Well, there's quite a few chapter 20s. There we go. I don't know if I'll be able to hear it, but can someone online verify that you can see the PowerPoint? And I cannot hear it. Oh, well. Anyway, we are at the beginning of chapter 20. We're talking about biodiversity. Long story short is, and I wish I had more time to talk about it, biodiversity is basically the thing that keeps our planet alive. So, it's not hyperbole to say without biodiversity, we wouldn't be here. And we are losing biodiversity. So eventually it is going to be a life or death situation. I will say that some people might be a little alarmist about it. It's hard to say because we don't know exactly when it'll be a life and death situation. But eventually, common sense tells you it would have to be eventually a life and death situation. Anyway, we talked about genetic diversity, which is like when you're looking at the gene pool of one species and you're looking at all the different alleles. And I used humans as an example of that because, forgetting about the reasons that there's other reasons that humans are more or less susceptible to COVID-19, but there is probably a genetic component, and that's the example I used for genetic diversity, was saying that the fact that some humans got COVID and didn't even have any symptoms, yet other humans died from COVID, right? That might be a genetic thing, and that shows you why genetic diversity is good, because if we were all like those humans that died from COVID, then this whole pandemic may have just wiped out the human race for the most part. But it didn't, because we have genetic diversity. Then we talk about species diversity. To me, that's the easiest. Academically, anyway, it's the easiest because that's just talking about all the different species. So if we talk about the species diversity in this room, it's very little, right? As far as we can see, it's only humans. Of course, there's other things. There's probably mold and fungus and bacteria that we don't see. But for the most part, right, when we're talking about species diversity, that's what we see. Next thing we're going to talk about, this is where we left off, ecosystem diversity. And I don't like the way your book presents this, because I wish you would have learned a little bit more about ecosystems before you learned about ecosystems diversity. But I teach out of the book, so let's jump into it. What is an ecosystem? Well, it includes the organisms and the abiotic factors in a particular area. So basically, you can think of it like this, because you guys are already familiar with what a population is, because we've been talking about that a lot. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that are in the same area at the same time, right? They're interacting with each other. That's a population, right? So you think about the squirrels in WVSU's campus. That's a population. Then you go a step above that. A step above that are communities, and we've talked about that before, right? Communities are not just that population of that one species, but all the other living things that they're interacting with. So for squirrels, you're talking about the humans that they're on this campus that they're interacting with, and the cats that they're trying to avoid, and the acorns that they eat, right, from the oak trees. That's a community. That's when you're looking at all the living things and how they interact. Then you go a step above that, and that's where we're finally at as an ecosystem. So we're still looking at a community, which is how all these different living things interact. But now we're also including all the non-living factors. Like, for example, there might be more squirrels on the other end of the campus than there are on here. Why? Maybe the sounds of the interstate scare them. So right, that would be a factor, right? And the interstate, the sound from the interstate would affect the community, but it's a non-living thing, right? The sounds from the interstate are not a living thing. That's an abiotic factor. Or when you talk about the grass that grows around Hamblin, it's probably different on one side of the building than it is on the other, because probably one side of the building gets more shade than the other, right? And that would be an abiotic factor. Anyway, anybody have any questions about what an ecosystem is? All right. If you do, meet me during office hours, because really I could talk so much about ecosystems. They're really fascinating, really important, but we're on a time crunch here. This brings us to ecosystem services. This is a very important concept, especially if you ever decide to take my Bio 108 class one day. This is a big heads up, a big head start for that class. Ecosystem services are functions that are performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people. Basically, in a lot of cases, it's just what keeps us alive. Oxygen, we get that from the ecosystems, right? Because photosynthetic organisms take carbon dioxide out of the air and they make oxygen in the process of making glucose, right? Air and water purification. So when you get water from ground sources anyway, it went through the ecosystem, right? It got purified. Climate regulation. Our climate in West Virginia would be a lot different if we did not have all these trees and photosynthetic organisms. You know, like if it was a desert type situation. I could go on, but I can't. Erosion control is a great example. So I don't know if you guys have seen the new maintenance, or not the new maintenance, the new construction on I-64 at the St. Albans exit. Have you guys seen that? Anyway, they blasted a lot of rocks. They basically cut a lot of the hillside off. And what do they do after that? They threw grass seed on there. Why? Because that helps control soil erosion. Anyway, where's my little marker here? I don't think I'm going to ask examples. These specific examples, definitely, I probably won't ask for you to memorize. But just know, again, that an ecosystem is something, or an ecosystem service is basically stuff that gives us something, right? It keeps humans alive. Also, and I don't think we talk about it much in this course, but in Bio 108, we do talk a lot about it because Bio 108 is an environmental biology course. So a lot of times you're trying to balance like economics versus protecting the environment. Well, ecosystem services, not only do they keep us alive, but they're very valuable. For example, pollinating crops, right? All you have to do is plant crops, and then we've got butterflies and birds and bees that go out there and pollinate the crops for us. Now imagine if that didn't exist and you had to hire somebody to go out with a paintbrush and pollinate each flower on each plant, right? That would be so expensive. So anyway, those are ecosystem services. Are there any questions about ecosystem services, which will be the first word for today, by the way, or I guess phrase, because technically that's two words. Ecosystem services. All right. If there's no questions, we'll move forward. Your book gives another example. So again, I'm going to put a big X to this because it's just an example. But coral reefs are rich in species diversity, which is funny because we're not even talking about species diversity anymore, but whatever. Yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans. This gets close to home for me because I'm from the South. Like in first, second, third grade, and then in middle school, I lived in the Keys. My uncle ran a dive boat. So like I spent my summer on the coral reefs. So I've seen it through my childhood. They get worse and worse and worse. They really are. I've seen them dying. But anyway, 75% of the coral reefs on Earth are threatened, and that number is expected to top 90% by 2030 if the current abuses continue. So anyway, that's just an example. I don't know why your book decided to throw that one in there right there. It's good to know, but it's not very relevant in my opinion. But let's move forward. So that's ecosystem diversity. Let me just say this, because either your book didn't say it or I didn't include it on the PowerPoint on accident. one thing that I didn't mention in the PowerPoint, if we're talking about ecosystems diversity, we're not just talking about the diversity within the ecosystem, right? All the different species. What we're also talking about is all the different ecosystems in an area, right? So if you were to look at where we are right now, you know, we have like a forest type ecosystem across the I-64 from us. We have a river ecosystem on the other side of us. We have kind of like an urban ecosystem where we are right now, right? All these different ecosystems. And long story short, for ecosystem services to do their job, or for ecosystems to give us ecosystem services, then we need ecosystem diversity. We need all these different types of ecosystems doing all these different jobs and taking advantage of different climate situations. Anyway, so those are the three different types of diversity. You definitely need to know the difference between genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Now that we're going to talk about the three types of diversity, let's talk about the causes of declining biodiversity. As far as the exam is concerned, this bullet point is probably a little bit less important because there'll be fewer questions about it. But as far as the grand scheme of what you should take from this course, it's a very important bullet point. You don't need to write these down yet because we're going to talk about them separately. But the four main factors for the causes of declining biodiversity are habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive species, overexploitation, and pollution. So again, we're going to talk about all four of those separately. But basically, it all boils down to this bullet point right here. It's all about the expanding size and dominance of human population, right? If it wasn't for us humans, we wouldn't have, I mean, don't get me wrong, things wouldn't be perfect without us humans, but we certainly wouldn't be where we are right now. So all those four things are basically due to the human population expanding and becoming more dominant. So any questions before we jump into these four main factors that you do need to know? All right. The first one, habitat destruction. What you need to know about the habitat destruction more than anything else is that is the number one cause. Before I even talk about any of this, know that habitat destruction is the number one cause of declining biodiversity. And the easy way to remember that is all the other three all boil down to this, because one of them is invasive species. Well, what do invasive species do? They destroy the habitat. The other one is pollution. Well, what does pollution do? It destroys the habitat. The other one is overexploitation. And what does that do? It destroys the habitat. So if you can just remember that all those things destroy habitats, and you can remember the habitat destruction is number one. Anyway, your book gives some examples. I'm probably not going to ask you the examples because obviously that's not an extensive list. There's all kinds of things that destroy habitats, but agriculture is a big one, right? Because we all need to eat. We're addicted to eating, so to speak. We die if we don't. Urban development, right? So building new homes. Forestry, cutting down trees because we need wood or wood products, tree products. Mining, that's a big one. Obviously in West Virginia, it's a huge one, like this mountaintop removal that we see right there. But again, like I said, as far as the bullet point, as far as the exam is concerned, this bullet point right here is the most important. Habitat destruction is the greatest threat to biodiversity there is. And again, the easy way to remember that is because all those other things basically destroy the habitat as well. I'll put it next to this one because I'm not going to ask you these numbers. But your book says that habitat destruction affects over 85% of birds, because of habitat destruction, over 85% of birds, mammals, amphibians are threatened with extinction. That's a lot. Now, granted, I don't remember when this is posted or when this book was published, and I'd have to look this up to be quite honest, but I don't know if that means 85% of all the living individual organisms or if that means 85% of the species. And there is a difference between those two things, and we don't have time to talk about it right now. Any questions about habitat destruction? It's bad. It's very bad. It's the worst of the things listed. All right. If there's no questions about that, let's talk about invasive species again. And we talked about that last chapter, so this is it's an easy concept, so we can go through this one very quickly. That is the second greatest threat to biodiversity. I probably won't even ask you that. No, I won't. It might be on the study guide, but it won't be on the exam. I just want you to know what the first one is. The rest of them, whatever. What is an invasive species? As you already know, it competes with native species because it's not from there. It preys upon native species is another thing it might do, or it might parasitize native species. In other words, it's not good for the native species because it does one of those three things. Either it outcompetes it or it eats it. But you already knew that when we talked about cheatgrass and mongooses and kudzu and all that from the last semester. Lionfish, Burmese pythons, It's a really fascinating subject. And there's still a week to do extra credit independent work if you want. So if you're interested, look up some of that stuff. Stink bugs are an invasive species. Anyway, we're still talking about this. So once we're done, I'll take questions. But let me just move forward for now. Oh, no, we're not. We are done with talking about it. All right. One more thing. I'll give you a little information if you want to look this up for invasive species. I went to a place called Guam in the 2000s. And it was like a really beautiful tropical paradise, except there was hardly any birds. And I thought that was weird. But then I didn't think anything of it because I was 19 years old and just wanted to go drink. I mean, I was 21 years old and just wanted to go drink. Anyway, so I didn't give it any thought until later when I was a biology student. And I thought back, hey, that was kind of weird. Wonder why that island didn't have any tropical birds. So I looked into it, and it's because there was an invasive snake. And I won't tell you what it is because you can look it up if you want. But anyway, that invasive snake basically ate all the birds on the island. So it's interesting how the snake got there. It's also interesting how they're killing them. They're like taking mice and they're lacing them, like dead mice, and lacing them with Tylenol. Because I don't know if you know, but too much Tylenol is bad for you. It's also bad for snakes. So they airdrop these dead mice and they parachute from these helicopters. And then they land, and then the mice eat them, and then they overdose on the Tylenol, and it kills them. It's really a fascinating situation. Anyway, just some ideas for independent work if you want it. Any questions about invasive species? They're not from here. They're bad. All right, the next one is also very easy. Overexploitation. Is basically when you over-harvest things at rates that exceed the ability of the population to rebound. So if there's a population of fish, and those fish have 1,000 offspring a year, and you are harvesting 2,000 offspring a year, then guess what? That's not sustainable, right? That's overexploitation. Eventually, because you're taking more than are being replaced, it's going to go away. Same with the Brazilian rainforest, right? The Amazon rainforest. We are cutting down trees faster than we are replanting them. So eventually, we're going to run out. So yeah, I guess that's the main bullet point for this slide as far as the exam is concerned. The next word for attendance, I'll just underline it or square it off, whatever. I won't even say it this time, but there it is. The next word for attendance. Anyway, excessive commercial harvesting, poaching, and sport hunting have greatly affected populations of tigers, American bison, Galapagos tortoises. That's something else you might be interested in writing about for independent work. That sport hunting thing, it's interesting to me that your book put it in there because in some cases, sport hunting have been clearly good. Like in the state of West Virginia, for example, hunting deer, for example, it's highly regulated. There's somebody out there who figured out how many we need to kill every year to keep a nice balance. So in that case, hunting is good. And there's even some places out there where they let you come in and you basically kill lions and exotic animals, and they're not even really out there in the wild. So it's almost like shooting fish in a barrel, which seems very unethical, and it is kind of. But people spend tens of thousands of dollars for it, and other people say they're horrible people for doing that. But those tens of thousands of dollars go back towards preserving like lions in the wild. So yeah. Depends on how you look at it. That would be an opinion piece you could write about. Like, how do you feel about that? Because obviously, people are very opinionated. Anyway, those are just examples. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to list those for the exam. Another thing, a lot of times when people think of overexploitation, they do think of animals, right? They do think of like harvesting parrots, right? Parrots, you can get those at the pet store, but now they're dwindling in the wild. Not a good thing. But what a lot of times people don't think of is plants. So yeah, you put those out there that sometimes plants are being overexploited too. Mahogany, rosewood, things like that. And again, just examples. I'm not going to ask you what kind of rare trees are being overexploited. Just an example. Any questions about overexploitation? All right, let's talk about the last one, the most common sense one, I think. This is very easy. Pollution. Air and water pollution is a contributing factor in the declining populations of many species. Actually, it's not just air and water pollution, but your book leaves it at that. It's a 100 level course. It also gets more complicated than that. There's also noise pollution. And I know that sounds weird, but I used I-64 as an example and how it might affect some of the species on this campus. Like there might be certain species where they're more on the other side, they are this side because they're afraid of the sounds. And there's also light pollution. I could go on and on. There's all kinds of pollution, but we'll stick with air and water pollution. Your book points out that the global water cycle transports pollutants from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems thousands of miles away, which is very relevant to us here in West Virginia. Because I don't know if you guys like to run or walk or ride bikes, but if you've ever been near just about any road in West Virginia, they're disgusting. Because I don't know why. People have a lot of pride for this state, but you don't see it when you look at the roads. It's disgusting. There's litter all over the place. But that's a great example. So I might be looking at a Natty Light can on the side of Tays Valley Road, but then that's probably going to get washed off in the next big rain, which is going to go down in the Kanawha River, which will go down the Ohio River, which will go down the Mississippi River, which will lead itself to the Gulf of Mexico back into the Atlantic Ocean, right? So your Natty Light can here in West Virginia, because you had a great Saturday night, you might be making pollution in the Atlantic Ocean. That's just one example. Of course, then there's the more dangerous things, because the one Natty Light can is not that bad. But think about all the stuff coming from places like John Amos and all the places where we get the coal to run John Amos. Anyway, oh yeah, that's more of this bullet point right here. Pollutants in the atmosphere are carried for thousands of miles, falling as acid precipitation. And I put a little star next to this because it's not just acid precipitation that's the problem. For example, coal-fired power plants put out mercury into the air. They get a lot of it out. They do. They've got scrubbers to get most of it, but some of it makes its way out. And I read a paper as an undergraduate where the Everglades is having a mercury poisoning problem because of coal power plants. Even though there are no coal power plants near the area, they use nuclear down there. But here we are in West Virginia protecting our economy, right? We burn coal, it's good for us. It goes into the atmosphere. It makes its way down to Florida, lands in the Everglades. And the Everglades, that's also a tourism place in Florida. It's all tourists, right? So our economy, we do things to protect our economy, which then go and help destroy Florida's economy. So it's interesting how all these things work thousands of miles away. And that's the interesting thing about air and water pollution. It's not just located right here where you are. Anyway, any questions about air and water pollution? It's bad, and it travels. All right. That was the first main bullet point for chapter 20. And here we are on Monday. We're doing okay. Let's jump into the second main bullet point of this chapter, which is community ecology. And it's so interesting how your book presents these things, because I think we should have talked about this earlier, but whatever. Now we're going to take a step back. We just got finished talking about ecosystems, which remember is all those living things interacting together. But also it includes the non-biotic factors like how much sunlight, how much rain, how much noise pollution, blah, blah, blah. Now we're taking a step back and we're going to look at communities. So basically this is a step up from what we talked about in the last chapter. In the last chapter we talked about populations, which is that one group of individuals of the same species interacting, right? We're taking that a step up and we're going to look at all the different living species interacting. And that's what a community is. And I've said it before, we're saying it again. Here it is, again, written a different way from your book. It's an assemblage of species living close enough together for potential interaction. So it's not just one, again, it's not just one group of species interacting, because that would be a population. It's all the different living things in a given area. That's what a community is. So in this room, I'm looking at a population of humans. But what we have, even though you can't see it, is a community that includes humans and bacteria and probably some mold in the air. Maybe, I don't know. But definitely some bacteria, right? We all have at least bacteria in our stomachs and all the different insects that live in your face. And that's something you can look up for independent work if you want. But you all have arthropods living in your skin. Anyway, that's a community. Any questions about what a community is? You definitely need to know the difference between a community and an ecosystem and a population for the exam. All right, here's a great picture of a community. So if we were just looking at the zebras, that would be a population. But we're not, because even though zebras themselves, that is worth studying when you look at all the different zebras and how they compete for resources like grass, how they compete for resources like getting away from a lion. Like, so the faster they are, the better they are at it. That's a population. But now we're looking beyond that. We're looking at a whole community. We're looking at that lion that killed the zebra, and that is also trying to compete with the hyena and the vultures to keep away from the kill. And then we're looking at all the grass that was eaten by the zebra, that is going to get nourished once that thing rots, and once these things poop out the meal, right? The circle of life continues. But anyway, yeah, that's a community, right? It's a great example of a community. You can see all these different things interacting, all these different species, all kind of intertwined and all affecting each other. Woo! Here we go. This is a big one, but this should be really common sense to you. I hope everything I'm about to tell you, I hope I'm just about to give you a word for something that you already knew existed. I hope. Should be. If you've ever watched nature shows as a kid, this should ring some bells. Interspecific interactions. These are interactions between species. To jog your memory, the last time we said anything close to this was in the last chapter when I said intraspecific interactions, which were interactions between the same species. But now we're talking about interspecific. So that picture we just saw, that was interspecific interaction. The zebra eating the grass, interspecific. The lion eating the zebra, interspecific. The lion competing with the hyenas and the vultures, interspecific. So that's the main thing you need to know for this bullet point, is what an interspecific interaction is. Does anybody see what this picture is? Can you guys tell what that is a picture of? Right there. No guesses? That red line? That's a great guess. When you send me your attendance, please remind me you took a guess, so you get a little extra credit for taking a guess. It does look like a river, and I wouldn't expect anybody to really know it, especially with it being this blurry, but that's I-64. I-64, the I stands for interstate, because it takes you between different states. The only reason I put that there is to help remind you the difference between interspecific interactions and intra. So remember, inter is between, right? So if you can remember that interstates bring you between different states, then you can remember interspecific interactions are between different species. Anyway, so again, this first bullet point, that's the main thing you need to know for the exam. This next bullet point is a segue into what we're about to talk about. These different interactions are classified according to the effect that they have on the populations concerned. You definitely don't need to write that down. That's just the introduction to what we are about to talk about. The next word for attendance will be, I guess, phrase, road trip. Now that I'm looking at I-64, it has inspired me. All right, any questions? Okay, so again, and there's no need to write this down yet either, because we're going to get a little bit more specific. But again, if we're talking about the interactions between species and we're talking about basically categorizing them, there's also another way of looking at it. Now, there's going to be different specific words, and that's what we're going to come back to. But before we talk about that, you probably already know that this exists. They're either negative for both species, they're positive for both species, or they're good for one and bad for the other. That's a very plain way of putting it. In some cases, you can get more specific and more detailed and say, well, in some cases, they're good for one species and, doesn't even affect the other species, but we won't even get into that. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about these because we're going to talk about them as we move forward. Just remember that sometimes it's bad for both, sometimes it's good for both, sometimes it's bad for one, good for the other. So the first one we're going to talk about, interspecific competition is the first one we're going to talk about. Interspecific competition. And in a way, this is what we've already been discussing, but we're just kind of put it out there again. That is between species, right? So again, I don't know, zebras and any other kind of herbivore, right? They would be in competition for eating the grass. That's just one example. When it comes to interspecific competition, the population growth of either of the competing species is limited by the population densities of the competing species, and of course the density of the the specific species itself, which again, as you already know from the last chapter, is intraspecific. So what determines if populations will compete? Let's talk about this before I take questions. First of all, there's a term you need to know. It's called ecological niche or niche. Either pronunciation is fine. That is an organism's total use of its biotic and abiotic resources. And a slightly inaccurate way to say it, but a great way to help you remember what it is. All right, we all know what a habitat is, right? A habitat, if we're talking about a species, the habitat is where it lives. You can think of a niche as its job. What does it do? And I'll give you an example. It's not on the book. If you think about a plant and you're talking about its niche, that's like everything. That's everything about it. Like it can stand it to be this hot. It can get up to this hot and then get to this cold, right? That's its temperature range. It likes its pH, the soil, to be a pH of this, high as this, or as low as this. It likes this much rainfall, but no more than that, and this much rainfall, no less than that, right? So think about a plant, or this much sunlight is too much, this much sunlight is not enough, right? So think about all those different things that a specific plant would have that it likes to survive in, right? That's its niche. It likes to have this much phosphorus in the soil as opposed to this much nitrogen, right? All these things. But anyway, so that's my example. Your book example are barnacles. If we look at the niche of the barnacles of a single genus, that includes where it lives, right? So yes, I know I said habitat is a habitat, but it also sometimes is a part of the niche, right? Where does it live? What does it eat? That's that second bullet point, the food that it filters from the water. And also, like I was saying about the plants, the climatic conditions, right? If we're looking at a genus of barnacles, remember there's different species in a genus. These different species have different things. Like some of them like the water temperature here. Some of them like the water temperature there. Some of them like the air temperature here. Some of them like the air temperature there. Some of them, the humidity can't be too much. Some of them, the air humidity can't be too small or too little, right? So it's got to be just right. And these things are different for each of the species. Now, granted, they overlap some, but they are different. And your book gets pretty specific, right? So we're talking about two different genuses here, excuse me. Instead of looking at one genus and the different species in the genus, we're talking about two different species, two different genuses. Yeah, so that's one. We talked about the one, and then for the other genus uses the same resources, like it's almost identical to the other genus, except it cannot survive as high above the low tide limit. And that might be hard for you to picture if you're not from a place that has tides. But what I'm saying here is these two genuses of barnacles are identical for what they need and all the things that they prefer. Except this one can't stay out of the water as long as the other ones, right? So this one up top, it's really good. It can stay out of the water longer. The one below it, it's just the same as the first one, except it's not as good as staying out of the water. So when these two inhabit the same area, they are competitors, right? Because they use the same space on the rocks, and they use the same food, and they prefer the same climatic conditions. Because of that, they're competing. So what happens is you can see when they're in the same area, right here, you've got one genus up top, right? That's the one that can do pretty good outside of the water. And then you've got the other genus at the bottom. So they compete when they're together. And it's not that this one up top can't live right here. It's just that they're competing for the same resources. And this one can't live up here, so this one's like, all right, I'll just hang out up here. But then when you get rid of this one species, the blue species, or genus, then this brown one takes over, right? Because when the other one's not there, there is no competition. This one just takes over. I guess the point here is you can see the fact that these two genuses are in competition because they pretty much use the same resources. So because of that, they're in competition. But if you get rid of one, then the other one takes over. And that's just showing that they do indeed use the same resources. Anyway, that's just an example. There'll be no questions about the barnacles on the exam. There might be on the study guide, but not on the exam. Any questions about this? All right. Here's the next thing you need to know, the competitive exclusion principle. This states that if two species have an ecological niche that's too similar, like the one we just saw, sort of, they cannot exist in the same place. They cannot coexist in the same place, which is true. Let me back up. Like I said, with the barnacles, that's kind of true because when they're both there, they kind of segregate, right? You've got the blue ones down here and the brown ones up there. They segregate themselves naturally because they're competing for the same resources. They can't compete. They can't coexist in the same space. So they naturally segregate. But your book gives the example of two different parameciums. Not that you need to know, but parameciums, as far as we're concerned, they're just single-celled organisms, right? So when that one cell, that is an organism. Anyway, there's two different species of these parameciums. Oops. And when you grow them together separately, and they are single cells, so just think of like those little petri dishes that we used in lab for the diffusion lab, right? If you're growing them separately, they kind of have a similar growth pattern. And this should be familiar too from the last chapter, right? That's an S, so that's a logistic growth curve. And you can see someone tracked the population growth. I don't know for how long. Oh yeah, I do. For 16 days, they graphed the population growth of these two different species. And you can see how similar they are when they grew separately. But then when they put them in the same culture and grew them together, where they compete for the same resources because they're too similar, well, one's bound to win and the other one's bound not to win. So in this case, the red one won and the blue one, it outcompeted the blue one. The blue one died. So that's the competitive exclusion principle. Basically, if they're too competitive, the one's going to win, one's going to lose. I will say this, because I don't remember if your book does say this. In nature, this is taken care of. Because if these were, for example, two different plants, because this does happen with plants, if you were to grow them separately, they would grow just fine. But then you grow them together, well, you guys already know this. No, you didn't do this lab. Never mind. When you grow them together, the plants, they compete, so one beats the other. But what happens in real life is as one plant starts beating the other, then all the herbivores in the area start eating that plant more than the other, right? Because it's easier to get. So then because of that, the red one would go down and the blue one would go up. But then once the blue one is the dominant plant species, then all the herbivores would be started to eat that one because then it's more easily available, right? Does that make sense? So in nature, this competitive exclusion principle kind of takes care of itself because as one beats the other one and becomes more prominent, well, then whatever it is that eats it, it's going to eat it. Any questions about that? I'll put a big old X through here. It's just an example. Won't be on the exam. Not those particular Paramecium, anyway. You do need to know what the competitive exclusion principle is, but you do not need to know the examples of these different Paramecium. Whew. Any questions about that? So that was interspecific competition, right? That's just basically just some basic stuff you need to understand about different competition or different species competing with each other. Now, again, that was competing with each other. That wasn't like one thing eating another. Those were like two things competing for the same resources. Now we're going to start talking about something a little bit different. Mutualism. You guys probably already know this. Can anyone tell me what mutualism is? I'm sure you've heard this word before. You guys have never seen nature shows. I'm sure somebody knows it. You just don't want to say it. But that's all right. Mutualism. It's when both species benefit. It's a plus. Mutualism is when both species benefit, right? So the last one we just talked about, which was interspecific competition, for the most part, both species, it's a negative in a way because both species are competing, so it's not good for either one of them. Now, granted, one usually wins over the other, but for the most part, it's bad for both of them. Mutualism, it's good for both. Some mutualism occurs between symbiotic species, and that's where there's a close physical association. So in a symbiotic species, it's not like it's just good for the two of them. It's like one can't exist without the other. Not only is it good interactions between them, but like they rely on it. So an example of that is this root fungus called Mycorrhizae. And again, it really is just a fungus that lives on roots for some plants. And for these plants, it delivers mineral nutrients to the plants, right? The plants, remember, plants make their own glucose, right? Their own G3P. But there's a bunch of stuff that they don't make. That's what they have roots for, right? To get stuff from the soil. Well, that's what the fungus is for. The fungus brings all that stuff. And in return, the fungus gets stuff like G3P and glucose. So they need each other. And as a matter of fact, with some plants, they do not exist without each other. And I don't have time to get into which plants, but you can look it up for independent work if you want. The next word for attendance then will be fungus. Any questions about this example of mutualism, which again is just an example, so it won't be on the exam. Any questions about mutualism in general? Again, good for both species. Your book gives some more examples. Corals. Corals depend on algae that live inside the cell. So if you look at a coral, inside the cell of that coral, not just the body of the coral, but inside the cell, which to me is fascinating, is algae. So in case you didn't know, coral is an animal. So we have an animal that has a plant living inside of it. Well, it's algae. So depending on what you look at, some people might call it plants, or excuse me, algae plants. Some people might call them protists, but anyway, it's definitely not an animal. It's a photosynthetic organism living inside of an animal. So what happens there? Well, the sugars that the algae produce provide energy for the coral, and in return, the algae gains the shelter from the coral and the coral's waste products. Because remember, here we're talking about an animal and a photosynthetic organism. So how perfect is that? The animal is producing carbon dioxide and using oxygen, and the algae is using carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. What a great little trick. Also, of course, ammonia. Because, you know, pretty much all animals produce some form of ammonia. We do it when we pee. What is it good for? Well, nitrogen. We'll talk about that later, but nitrogen is one of those important things that's sometimes hard to get. Anyway, the coral thing, just an example, won't be on the exam. Any questions about this slide? There's another video from the producers, publishers of your textbook. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch it. It's clownfish that like to live inside of sea anemone. They both interact. They both get something from that relationship. You can look it up if you want. There's so many examples of mutualism. You can look them up if you want. Very fascinating stuff, but we'll be done with it for now. Mutualism, it's pretty easy, right? Both species benefit. Sometimes both species are dependent on it. The next thing is almost like I don't say the opposite, but it's sort of the opposite of mutualism. Predation. You guys already know what this is. Predation is when one species kills the other. The predator kills and eats the prey. You already know this. So that's the easy part, right? That's if we could just leave it at that, we'd be done, because you all know what predation is. You all know that that would be a plus-minus situation. Like in this case, you know, good for the lion, bad for that zebra, right? But your book does go on to talk about a little bit of some other stuff that goes along with predation. For example, there are numerous adaptations for predator avoidance that have evolved in prey populations. So the zebras, anybody know why zebras have stripes? Because look at that thing. It's not exactly blending in, right? Does anybody know why zebras have stripes? Nope, no guesses? That's okay. Then it is to blend in, basically, because, yeah, that thing sticks out like a sore thumb when it's by itself. But if you're a lion and there's a bunch of zebras doing this in all kinds of different directions, and they're all striped anyway, it's hard to focus on your target, right? So there you go. Anyway, your book gives some examples. Speed is one example. Antelopes outrun their predators very often, right? And that would be natural selection. So there's going to be a bunch of antelopes, and there's going to be some natural variation. Some of them are going to be faster than the others. The slower ones are probably going to most likely be eaten and die and not pass along their genes. The faster ones will probably be most likely to pass along the genes. So technically, every generation, you would expect it to get a little bit faster and faster. Of course, what also happens is the same thing with the lions. The lions are also competing for resources. So the slower of the lions is less likely to eat and less likely to therefore survive and pass along his genes. So therefore, the lions over generations are going to get slowly faster and faster. So as the predator or prey gets faster, so does the predator. Anyway, rabbits, again, rabbits trying to get to their shelter. Just those examples. You don't need to know the examples, but that should be common sense, right? Speed is an adaptation. The faster you are, the more likely you are to reproduce. Therefore, natural selection is going to make species faster. Then there's also mechanical structures. Porcupines, on the quills on the porcupines. A clam's hard shell. A stinger on a wasp. There's so many things. A tortoise's shell, an armadillo's shell. You go on and on, but those are just examples. You don't have to know about them. Any questions about predation or the things, or so far we have more to talk about, but so far the things that have been evolved to help prey get away from the predators? All right, another thing is camouflage, or as your book calls it, cryptic coloration. And it makes you be able to hide, right? And a great example of that is the peppered moth. It just so happens that there were some black moths that were born. No single moth changed colors. I don't know how many times I can say that, but not one single white moth turned to a black moth. But some black moths just happened to be born. That just happened to be an advantage. So because of that, after generation after generation after generation, there was more and more and more black ones. That's cryptic coloration. So if you guys can see what is in these pictures, like, can you guys see what that is? Yeah, if I did that, it would be harder. But yeah, it's a frog. I think we have, a spider right here. And then shrimp or a seahorse? Seahorse right here. Anyway, those are some examples. You guys are familiar with camouflage. It's a very simple concept. Or if you download this PowerPoint, you can watch this video of seahorses. Then there's kind of like the opposite of camouflage, which is warning coloration. So instead of hiding, they're like, I don't need to hide. I'm going to let you know you don't want to eat me. Warning colorations are bright patterns of yellow, red, or orange with black marks, right? It's very contrasting. It's very easy to see. And it is usually coupled with effective chemical defenses. So not only do they look scary, but they are scary. Poison dart frog up top. Monarch butterfly. I mean, we don't eat them, so we don't worry about it, but they are not good. Like birds, that's not good for birds to eat. Those are just some examples. So again, those warning colorations, the predators know I'm not going to eat these things because they have some sort of chemical defense. Any questions about warning coloration? All right. Your book also points out that some prey may gain protection with something called mimicry. So under the category of warning coloration is something called mimicry. It is a copycat adaptation. So it's basically when you look scary, you know, because you've got the warning colorations, but it's all bark and no bite, so to speak. So you look like you might have some bad chemical defenses, but really you don't. One of the more common examples is this, the coral snake and the king snake. You guys know the little thing, the little saying to know which is which? Yeah. But that's it. Yeah, red on black, or I always heard red on black, friend of Jack, red on yellow, kill a fellow. And really that's it. That's the only difference, right? They've got the same colors, it's just a different pattern. So one of them is venomous, the other one's completely harmless. But anyway, that's mimicry. Any questions about mimicry? And of course, that's just an example. There won't be questions about coral snakes and king snakes on your final. No questions? All right. Some insects combine protective coloration with adaptations of disguises. You're already familiar with this, I'm sure, too. Some insects resemble twigs and leaves and even bird droppings. Some of them, right? So I'm sure you've seen bugs. I hate to use the term bugs because bugs is an incorrect term. That's a very specific type of insect, but whatever. There's some, I'm sure you guys have seen insects that look like sticks, right? And that's a great example. But then there's some more interesting ones, in my opinion, where they imitate vertebrates, right? So they're not just like blending in to look like a leaf or a stick. Some of them try to look like, in this case, a snake, right? So one of those pictures is a snake. One of those is a caterpillar. Obviously, the one on the right is the snake, but the one on the caterpillar, or the one on the caterpillar on the left, that looks, if you're like a bird and you're just scanning around through a bunch of trees and you're trying to find something to eat, and you see that, you're like, well, okay, let's leave that alone. Especially if you've got a whole forest of other options. But anyway, any questions about mimicry or any of these other examples? All right, let's all knock off another really easy one. Herbivory. Does anybody know what herbivory is? It's in the word. If you don't know what herbivory is, I bet you know what an herbivore is. No guesses? It's a store where they sell herbs like oregano. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that. Herbivory, which I'm assuming everybody knew, they just didn't want to say it for some reason. Herbivory is the consumption of a plant or plant parts by an animal. So when an insect eats a leaf, that is herbivory. When a rabbit eats a leaf or a root, that is herbivory. It's usually not fatal unless it's done by humans, because, you know, we'll just take the whole damn plant out of the ground and sell it at Kroger and eat it. But it's still bad, right? It's always good for the herbivore. It's always bad for the plant. Because of this, though, just like in predation, right, the way animals have evolved ways to avoid being eaten by other animals, plants have done the same thing too. And these are just examples, so you don't need to know them, but spines, thorns, trichomes, chemical toxins. So some examples are thorny rose bushes, spiky cacti, poisons produced by certain tropical vines, morphine from the poppy seeds, or not poppy seeds, but the flower, the poppies, yeah, excuse me, right? Morphine, it's interesting. That evolved as a way of keeping plants from or animals from eating it. And then humans were like, whoa, that'll sure get you high. And because of that, we have heroin and opioids and stuff like that. Nicotine, same thing. Plants evolved that to keep animals from eating it. And humans were like, whoa, that feels really good when I put that in my lip, or when I chew it, or when I smoke it. But anyway, that's why I like this bullet point right here. Defensive compounds that are not toxic to humans may be distasteful to herbivores and responsible for flavors. Anyway, basically, I like what your book is getting at. There's so many things that plants have done to evolve to keep from not getting eaten, and then humans are like, I like it, and I'm going to grow more of it. Cocaine, right? Caffeine, capsaicin, right? Anything that's spicy. That's because those plants want to be eaten by birds because birds will eat the fruit, fly around, and poop the seeds, and then therefore they're dropping their offspring off everywhere. And birds do that better than mammals. So only mammals can taste the heat. But the purpose there is for mammals to not eat it and for birds to eat it. But humans, again, we're like, I like that spiciness. Anyway, those are just some examples. You don't need to know about them. Point is, plants have evolved ways to evolve being eaten, and humans like them. And those are some of the examples: peppermint, cloves, cinnamon. So that's where we'll end off. Yeah, so the last word for attendance then will be parasites. So for those of you online, make sure you get me those words for attendance before 9 a.m. For those of you in person, please send me an email to remind me that you were here. I guess if you're in person and you happen to have the keywords, send those to me too. I'll give you even more extra credit because you didn't have to write down the keywords, but I saw some of you doing it. So I just want to reward you for doing so. Any questions? All right, I'll be online for office hours if anyone needs me. We will not be meeting for lab today, but I'll try to be available if you need my help.
Is there going to be a review for the panel?
Yes, I plan on doing a review. Yeah, one way or the other, I'm going to make it happen. So great point.
This one, the red, like next one.
Yeah, unless you want to take it at a different time, in which case, just contact me sometime this week so we can work it out.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.